here, and I'd like to talk with you this week about research leadership. In many national systems, women are the majority of PhD students, but women's role in research management and research leadership is rarely as visible. While we do see women in Deputy Vice-Chancellor roles for teaching, for learning, for students, for education, in research, men dominate. And often these are men from the experimental and medical sciences. While these outstanding researchers certainly deserve acclaim and the title, there are consequences to institutions and to knowledge, let alone our universities, if we perpetuate blind spots in methodology, ontology, epistemology, disciplinary literacies, and of course, gender. I wanted to talk with Professor Priscilla Dunk-West this week about research management and research leadership and the future of both of these terms. Now, Priscilla, it's wonderful to talk with you again. And look, it is still really challenging for women to enter research leadership posts. You know this, and I know this. Now, thankfully, there is a wonderful leadership pathway for women to DVC education, DVC students, or the DVC academic role, and that's really welcome. But women in research leadership, that's still a really rare pathway, I would argue, particularly in Australia. But what do you believe are the continued challenges for women gaining leadership roles in research?
It's a really good question, and I think the landscape has changed, but I feel like increasingly we kind of do this whack-a-mole sort of thing where you have advances in somewhere and then it pops up somewhere else in a different kind of way, you know what I mean? And so I think, yes, we've made headway. I always think it goes back to that question of epistemology and knowledge, right? So how do we know what we know, and who do we listen to as the voice of authority? And traditionally, who has it been? You know, white, middle class, highly educated men, cisgendered men. Yep. And so you kind of have this dominance of a particular type of person in the field of particularly research, and research has always been positioned, I think, as oppositional to teaching. And so there's this been real, teaching as women's work sometimes, teaching as the nurturing kind of feminine side of things, and then research as this kind of hard-nosed masculinist kind of construct. And so that way of thinking about knowledge then positions men as being, the voice of authority in that space, which, as we know, is kind of really embedded in ideas of leadership, right? This kind of hierarchical, holding power, leading in that sort of way. So I think that all of those ingredients kind of coalesce into this situation, which has women's research, and particularly feminist research, for example, as being seen less than. So as a qualitative researcher, I feel this all the time, right? Quantitative is often seen as the proper kind of research. Now, this absolutely is shifting. It's shifting, it's changing, there's hope. And so we've got an acknowledgement of Indigenous knowledges, for example, and repositioning, how we think about who has had the power to speak on behalf of, who has had the power to say, what's true and what's not true. And so we've seen this sort of decentering of that kind of sentiment, but at the same time it still persists. So I think, yes, women are advancing in leadership in these spaces, but often this would be a really interesting activity to see how many are associated with the pure sciences. Yeah. Like how many social scientists are in those leadership positions, or how many people who... Anyway, so yes and no, I think.
And of course, Priscilla, I have done that research with a very attractive physicist who I accidentally sleep with. And we did that research, and I know this will come as a shock to you, but research leadership roles are dominated by the experimental scientists, engineers, and particularly the medical sciences. Now, I know that may be a surprise to you.
Very shocking, very shocking.
Yeah. And look, the only other funny bit I'll add to that is, of course, as you've rightly said, that bizarre teaching research binary, which shouldn't be a binary, is in place. But, of course, people who have been in roles like me, a Dean of Graduate Studies or a Dean of Graduate Research, that's the teaching part of research. And, of course, that used to be the job that women used to have. But, of course, now the Dean role has been lost and it's been reconfigured as a Pro-Vice-Chancellor research training, and now the men are in those roles as well.
Wow, that's so interesting, because I always think of the research higher degrees, the research higher degree, well, at least, you don't have those traditional, but you do have those divisions. Yeah, right.
Oh, it's fascinating.
That's really interesting.
Now,
yes.
As you and I have talked about so often, international university research is really volatile, particularly at the moment, and international university research funding is even more volatile. And we're finding at the moment, in the last 2 weeks, entire labs and research projects are being closed, truncated, stopped, and PhD scholarships are being withdrawn in the United States. So what would you recommend to all our colleagues that are attempting to create a personal or a departmental research plan in these tough, volatile times when funding is being removed?
It's tricky, right? It's a really tricky environment at the moment. And I think, I do have a sense of nostalgia for the days of old when you could just follow your nose and do whatever research you wanted to. So in some institutions you can still do that. Other institutions are only saying to researchers, you must only do research if it's funded, you must publish here, and those sorts of things, those hangovers from old research measurements of excellence are still around. And so if you have the scope to follow your nose and do that research that interests you rather than fitting into an agenda that's set by somebody else, then I say, go for it. And often there are ways that people can bring in an adjacent perspective. And I'll give you an example. So let's say I'm interested in education. For example, this is a grant that myself and some colleagues got some years ago. We were interested in trauma and education and what educators can do to mitigate the effects of trauma or to work in ways that were flexible in a high school setting. So we looked at flexibility in looking at alternative educational settings, and we looked at a couple in particular, one in particular, and that's of interest to me as a social worker, as someone who's worked with young people in education, as someone with lived experience of having an awful experience of high school, but loved university. And so that brings in my kind of lens of lived experience, if you like, into the research, but it was funded. So you can, but I also research, families and parenting and intimate relationships. So you can see it's kind of adjacent to my research interests, but I'm bringing myself to the research that is funded. So that's a way to kind of bring in that lens, I suppose, that you hold. And so in that sense, you're not necessarily at the mercy of the funding bodies. Does that make sense?
Oh, look, it does. And I think you're therefore building the interfaces. You've used positionality and lens and lived experience there beautifully. Yes. And actually what you're doing is, say, from social work, because it is such an important applied social science, it's building the facets that increase the interfaces with other disciplines that enable funding, enable those really productive collaborations. I think that's a brilliant suggestion. But, I'm getting frightened. I just read the document this morning in a particular US grant body where I think they've banned 96 words. And, and those words, if they're used in the application, it's dismissed. One of those words is woman. I think another one of those words is female. So, what has already been sort of this gap or this absence in thinking about, medical research on women is a great example of, the blind spot through centuries. But that blind spot is now back because that research is not even being funded.
It's hard not to feel, be astounded by this, but also feel absolute horror and fear at this. I mean, it's a very serious situation that we're in, and I think, I think it's important to see that knowledge is under attack in this space, and so ways to platform people's lived experience through research and promote the inclusion of people into research that have been excluded through research, those kind of social justice aims. I always hope that, and we see this maybe a little bit, just to get a bit political, but we see this a little bit in Canada and perhaps even Australia, that this kind of what's happening in the US is kind of pushing us a little bit more towards our social justice kind of commitments, particularly in higher education, as we recognise that we've got to widen participation, right? We've got to get people engaged in universities and break down the kind of the ivory towers, perhaps, that we had in the past. And so in Australia, yes, we're in a different situation, but you're right, the ripple effects of this is being felt in Australian universities.
And it's a great way to meet new people and meet new friends, to care for others who have been excluded. It's that weird thing about when you become othered. When you're othered, you meet all the other interesting people who have also been othered. So it's a great way to meet mates.
It's all the cool people. All the cool people. I mean, what did Bell Hooks say? Everything interesting happens at the margins. So let's stay there. But I need to move to my next question, because we talked already about the nature of how we evaluate research. And in Australia, the ERA has been parked, and I think perhaps parked indefinitely. I'm not sure when something becomes parked so long that it disappears, but we'll just say it's parked at this point. Now, if you were developing, and I would love you to do this, I think you should be in charge of everything, but if you were developing a new way of thinking about research assessment in Australia, what would be your priorities? It's such a hard one, because research assessment assumes that there's research that's not great, and so I think that just to kind of bang on about the same things that I always say about research, is that you've got to have a kind of ethical lens to research. So there's got to be a test of, and there is a movement towards, for example, co-design, so designing research with people to whom that research matters, with lived experience of the phenomenon, and so thinking about that, I think, would be a measure, right? Does this hold up to the test of, where's has power been conceptualised? Yeah, let's just throw out all those old measures of research quality and go with some kind of ethical, statement, framework, way of gauging research quality. That would be cool, right? To think about. Has the researcher thought about power and inequality and, what are the aims of the research? And in that sense, you start to get onto that kind of impact and engagement sort of stuff. Accessibility, I think, is really the other thing. So where are the research findings going to go? How are they disseminated? What public-facing role does the researcher have in talking about their research? Is it going to sit somewhere and just sit in a little journal somewhere that, 5 people will read?
Or is it going to move? Is it going to dance?
Yes, exactly.
Oh, I think that's amazing.
So they're the things.
I think that's amazing. In the old days, we used to ask that great question about research, which I always loved. We used to ask students this, why have they made this decision? The first question we always asked students about their topic was, what's changed? What changed to draw you to this topic? What's changed from your research? And if you think deeply about that question, I think research impact and engagement changes. Oh my goodness me. Last question. Okay, you and I, let's do this. You knew I was going to go here. Now look, you and I both write books. We're basically the only people left. We'll turn the lights out when we leave. But it remains amazing to me that Australian research culture has demonstrated so many challenges in validating, assessing, valuing the scholarly monograph. So a couple of questions. why do you think books are so difficult to evaluate and assess? And what would you recommend to our higher degree students and early career researchers who are completely as obsessed by you as I am, who may be considering writing a book? Is it worth the time and the effort, Priscilla?
Well, I'm biased. I'm going to say write the damn book. Like, write the book. We need more book people. I don't know why. Why don't people like books? And when I say people, early on in my career, I was told don't write books. No, they're not considered serious, and they're not considered serious in relation to research measurements. And I didn't listen to that, and wrote the books because I felt like I could, some of the books I write are for students, so I felt like I could talk to students through my books. And so I think it's a hangover from the gold standard publish a journal article, which may be the case if you're doing a clinical randomised controlled trial that you want to publish. That may be the gold standard. But when you're in the social sciences or humanities, things are messier than what can be put in a journal article. And so books are a beautiful way to kind of tease apart the issues, to go into depth into things, to kind of do the dance across different subjects and perspectives. And so I think that's the beauty. And so think about, I guess, if you are a research higher degree student, think about your dissemination, like who would be interested in reading this book, and then think about, is this going to be a fun thing for you to do? Does it give you a chance to do something in a different way? I think you've got to do what fits for you in terms of, thinking about your own passions and your own desires. And so often when researchers are writing up their research, they find themselves, I remember when I was writing my PhD up, I remember writing in a very inaccessible way, and thinking, this is, it doesn't even make sense. You start to you develop this sort of language, and writing a book, I feel like there's more space to write, and so therefore you're challenged to write in a very clear way, but you're given the freedom to be able to engage with the reader, to talk to the complexities a little bit more. So I'm biased, but I'm a fan of the book, as I know you are.
See, and I don't think you are biased. When you're as old as I am and close to death, when people do introductions for you with talks, they always say, Tara Brabazon, author of 21 books. That's what stays with you. But of course, we're finishing where we started because, of course, the people in leadership roles in research have never written a book because they're from the disciplines that don't write books.
That's right.
So perhaps what we're arguing for, you and I, is the importance of diversity in research leadership to validate a diversity of research outputs.
Yes, nicely stated. And you use the dirty D word at the moment, diversity, which is, something that's under attack. So, I mean, well stated.
Yeah, so diversity, so they're our mates. As diversity's being othered, we're all the interesting people are being diverse. So let's continue being diverse. And I've loved this conversation. And next week, I think we're doing a request. We've started to get requests, so let's do that. But I've loved that. I've been looking forward to this one for ages. So thank you, my love.
Thank you.